All right, guys, here we are, lecture 3 for our agriculture unit. This will take us from slide 65 through slide 84, which is the end of the presentation, end of the slide deck. All right, so here's our big enduring understanding. Agricultural production and consumption patterns vary in different locations, presenting different environmental, social, economic, and cultural opportunities and challenges. So obviously things aren't the same everywhere, and because they're not the same everywhere, we're going to run into different challenges and opportunities in the environment, the culture, the economic systems, and the social systems as well. Okay, so that's what we are going to be today. Topic 5.10 is specifically referring to the consequences of agricultural practices. So by cultivating crops, by harvesting crops, by distributing and manufacturing various food products, what consequences do we inherit from those activities? So most of them, not all, but many of them are going to be environmental consequences. Okay. So the environmental issues that are related to agriculture and land use include the following: pollution, water, air, and soil. Soil degradation. Degradation means like the breakdown of the soil or the leaching of essential nutrients in the soil. And salinization. Salinization is when you add salt, okay, or the soil gets salt into it from a variety of different things. Soil degradation and salination generally are the result of over-farming and the use of certain fertilizers and pesticides. Reduction in biodiversity. So specifically the idea that we're clearing land for one particular crop, which destroys habitats and it disrupts ecosystems. Overgrazing. So allowing livestock to overgraze, which results in the loss of topsoil, right? Those shrubs and grasses that the livestock are going to graze on help, their root systems are what keep that soil good, keep the topsoil on the ground. And if you allow the livestock to overgraze it, then those root systems get destroyed and that soil gets blown away or washed away in rains, right? Desertification, where once arable land becomes desert. So if you've got really good land, conducive to farming, good soil, good water access, and rain, if you misuse it or overuse it, you are going to destroy that land and it won't be able to use anymore. It'll be turned into a desert. Water sources get depleted. So aquifers, lakes, rivers, etc. get depleted. Animal waste. Okay, so what happens to all of those cow pies? Where do they go? What do we do with them? How do we dispose of them or use them, right? Extensive fertilizer and pesticide use, which adds chemicals to the soil and ultimately to the groundwater. How does that impact the local population and the other, vegetative and animal diversity in the area? And then human alteration of the landscape. That's a big one. We use the land for our own purposes, right? And so we'll make terraces if we're trying to farm in a mountainous region. We'll cut down trees if we need more land in a forested region. We will irrigate, which means we're pulling water out of rivers or lakes or aquifers and putting it somewhere that it didn't used to be, right? So all of those things alter the natural environment, which many people feel has negative consequences that we don't fully understand yet. All right. This is just a flow chart of environmental consequences. So environmental systems are affected by land use and land cover change. Examples include irrigation, desertification, deforestation, wetland destruction, conservation efforts. So environmental impacts of agriculture, that's our big top here. Traditional agriculture goes this way. Modern agriculture goes this way. So traditional agriculture, you're going to see things like forest clearing, soil erosion, depletion of nutrients. Modern agriculture, which uses machinery, uses pesticides, uses fertilizers, right? Irrigation, all that kind of stuff. We see salinity issues in the soil, water logging, which is where you flood, right, and actually add too much water, pesticide-related impacts, fertilizer-related impacts, impacts related to high-yielding varieties, and then from there, right, they just continue on. Additional impacts that we're seeing from our modern version of agriculture. All right, this, I'm gonna see if I can blow this up a little bit. This shows stress levels of water. So water stress levels of urban areas with populations bigger than 3 million. So what you're looking at is where in the world is water scarcity an issue, okay? Meaning there's a lot of people, but there's not a lot of water, okay? So the extremely high is this dark red color up here. Oh, let me get my pen back. This dark red color up here. High is sort of that orangey red color. Medium high is orange. Low to medium is light orange. And then low is yellow. So if we look, where do we see water issues, specifically water scarcity issues? Well, the big one is right here, right? We know that there's huge populations, especially in India, and the fact that this area of land is fairly dry, right? We've got the Sahara Desert, we've got the Rub de Khali, which is the empty quarter there in the middle of the Arabian Peninsula. So we've got lots of deserted areas or dry climate areas. And so water then becomes a big issue. When we add to that huge explosions of population in India especially, and then also down here through the Middle East, that's Pakistan, that's Afghanistan, Iran, we see more strain on the already scarce water sources. It's also interesting to note, we see that in some developed areas as well. This right here is Italy. This over here is Spain. Okay, so they have water issues as well. And then, of course, if we look over here in the western United States, we see water issues as well into Mexico. Okay. It also should be mentioned over here in East Asia. That's where Beijing is. Now, China generally has water, right? They're not a dry climate. They don't have, water issues as far as rainfall goes or anything like that. But here is where you're going to see the strain of population against the water resources that do exist, where we end up with crazy amounts of people and still, the same amount of water. And so that becomes a much bigger issue. All right. So additionally into sustainability challenges, urbanization is big because the more people you add, the more water you need access to. Unfortunately, water is something called a closed system. All the water that exists in the world is all the water that has ever existed in the world, and it just keeps continually cycling through the water cycle, right? Gas, liquid, solid, yeah, right? But so while we still have the same amount of water we've always had, we have lots more people. And so that becomes a huge issue in making sure that we have the water resources that we need to support the people that we have. So expanding urban areas is reducing agricultural land. The U.S. has lost 500,000 acres of prime agricultural land, which means the most productive farmland, specifically to urban sprawl along the East Coast. So that's a big deal because we've got more people, which means they need places to live, which means places that we used to use for farmland, we don't anymore. Now it's being developed, it's being turned into neighborhoods and cities and houses and all that good stuff. But we still need food, right? We still need agricultural land. Desertification is another big challenge. The degradation of semi-arid land, mostly due to human action, over-farming, overgrazing, drought, deforestation, population growth, all of those things impact desertification. The UN estimates that desertification removes 70 million acres from agricultural production each year. So that's the size of Colorado. Yeah, that's a big span of land that now is not producing food anymore because we have overused it. And then waterlogging is the third that we're going to talk about. Excessive water from human-built irrigation systems can cause the land to become waterlogged if there isn't proper drainage. Okay. Salinity in the water can also be a problem, as salty water can damage plants. So if you look over here in the pictures that I've included, this bottom one is a good example of waterlogging. The idea that we know plants need water, right? So we irrigate, but if the drainage doesn't happen, or if we're irrigating too often, then we're actually going to kill the plants by watering them too much instead of not enough. Something else that has come recently, and by recently I mean probably in the last 15 years, is this idea of individual food choice, that people can decide what they want to eat based on the plethora of options that they have. We're going to see this much more so in developed countries because the people there have the money to do this. So there's movements with individual food choice, and a lot of those movements are things that we're going to talk about here. So urban farming, this idea of, community gardens, that kind of stuff. Community supported agriculture, same idea. Organic farming, organic is big these days, right? We don't want any pesticides, we don't want any fertilizers, we just want straight from nature food. Value added specialty crops. So what those are is that's like, let's say you like asparagus, but you don't want raw asparagus. You want the pickled asparagus that you get in the fancy little jar that you put on your charcuterie board, right? You want that kind of specialty crop. Specialty crops you're going to find a lot with like jams and chutneys, anything that needs to be pickled. So pickles, olives, beets, hearts of palm, and asparagus, all of those types of things. Those are value added, where you take the crop and you do something to it that then allows you to charge more for it. Fair trade, we're going to talk about fair trade specifically when we do our chocolate lab. Fair trade is a big deal. It's basically the idea of making sure that where we get our food, that the people that are growing that food and harvesting that food and working with that food are being paid a fair wage, a living wage. This is a huge deal in the chocolate industry. So we will talk about that more specifically when we talk our chocolate. Local food movements, that would be, that's like peaches in Georgia and apples in Washington, right? Where there's a particular crop that's kind of not famous, but specifically tied to that region. So potatoes in Idaho, right? Avocados in California. And then dietary shifts. This is a big one recently. This would be like your gluten-free, raw is a new big diet thing, keto, right? All of those types of things are then going to impact how food is created, how it's manufactured, how it's processed, and how it's labeled, right? How it's advertised, all of those things. All right, influences on food production. Patterns of food production are influenced by food choice issues. So if give the people what they want kind of thing. So organic farming, value-added specialty crops, fair trade, local food movements, all of those impact what manufacturers decide to do with the food. You have to have a market. You have to have some kind of chain that gets your products from point A to point B. That's why farmers do not raise deer, elk, and buffalo. There isn't a global demand yet. So we talked in class about how Americans are very picky about their protein, right? We eat beef, we eat chicken, we eat fish, and we eat pork. And that's pretty much it. So things like elk, buffalo, deer, there isn't a demand for it. certainly not in our country, and really not globally either. However, if that changes, then all of a sudden you're going to start seeing, people raising elk, people raising buffalo, because they can market it. All right, topic 511 is challenges to contemporary agriculture. So we're still with our big enduring understanding. Agricultural production consumption patterns vary in different locations, presenting different environmental, social, economic, and cultural opportunities and challenges. Okay, so improving agricultural productivity. This is a big deal right now because of our increasing population. We have to be smarter and more technologically advanced when it comes to agriculture, because we have to be able to feed the 8 billion people almost that are on our planet. So increased agricultural productivity has resulted in the expansion of the food supply, which is exactly what we want. You'll remember way back in, I think it was Unit 2, we talked about Maslow, right? And how he said that if we got too big, that we would run out of food, right? That our exponential growth in people and our geometric growth in food production would ultimately end up, we wouldn't have enough food for all the people that we had on the planet. Well, what he didn't foresee was that things like new technology and new methods and new types of seeds would all come together and help us actually produce more with the same amount of land that we have. Okay, so what we see is an intensification of subsistence farming. So population growth requires subsistence farming to increase output. So they are developing new farming methods, including things like tools, right? Plows, weeding, manure, more terraces, more irrigation. All of these things are going to increase the output of subsistence farmers. They are also allowing shorter periods for the land to fallow. So remember we talked about how they'll come in, slash and burn, right? They'll slash the vegetation, they'll burn it, which will infuse the soil with certain nutrients. And then after they've used that field for a couple of years, they'll let it fallow, right? They'll let those weeds and that vegetation take over again. And sometimes they'll let that field sit for years and years and years and years and years, so that the fallow gets thick again, right? Everything becomes overgrown again, so that when they come through, they can burn everything down again and use that field again for another few years. But allowing shorter periods of fallow means that you are going to expend the nutrients in the soil much more quickly, because you haven't input enough, because the growth wasn't as thick, because you didn't let it sit as long. So phases of fallow land include forest fallow, bush fallow, short fallow, annual cropping, or multi-cropping. So short, bush, forest, that gives you an idea of what types of vegetation grow back, right? Forest fallow is the longest time, because now you've got trees there too. Bush fallow is, we've got shrubbery, but we don't really have anything above knee size or waist size. Short fallow is just like the very basic weeds are starting to come back in. Annual cropping means that you don't allow the field to fallow at all. And then multi-cropping is you work that field year round. Commercial farming, on the other side, as far as we're still talking improving agricultural productivity. Commercial farming means that productivity is also up there, due specifically to new seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, mechanical equipment, and management practices. The example that I believe it's the book gives, is this idea that dairy farming has actually reduced the number of cows that are in our dairy milk shed, but milk production is up 78% over the last 34 years. That is because of, we've learned how to optimize and be very efficient in how we harvest milk, right? We've got the milking machines now. We know what we need to feed the cows in order for them to produce the most milk. We know how long exactly that the cows need to go between milkings, all of that stuff, all of that research and information has contributed to us having the information and also the technology advancements to make sure that we can still produce what we need, when actually we're reducing the number of cows that we need to use. All right, GMOs. GMOs are a hot button topic. Those of you who are in biology, I don't think you've gotten to this discussion yet, but you will. You will talk about the existence of GMOs, the pros and the cons of GMOs. But really what it comes down to, GMO stands for genetically modified organism. And basically what it is it is a seed that has been altered on a cellular basis, DNA level basis, for certain things. Things like it will produce more, right? So it's modified to have a higher yield. It's modified to require less water. It's modified to grow faster. It's modified to be more resistant to things like insects, okay? All of those things are good things, excellent things, right? We can grow more, we can grow it faster, we can grow it with less water, we can grow it with less fertilizer, we can grow it without pesticides. All of those are good things. However, there is a very vocal population or group of activists that are categorically opposed to GMOs. It's, in their opinion, it's kind of at the level of playing God, where you're actually interfering with the natural process of growing something from on an organic level, right? And so they believe that GMOs should be labeled. I'm here to tell you probably, every single one of you in this class right now probably has some type of GMO sitting in the refrigerator right this second. Because in the United States, it's not as big of an issue. It hasn't, you kind of still hear a little bit sometimes in the news, sometimes it'll show up on my news feed or in the paper or whatever. But it's not as big of an issue in the United States because we don't have the requirement that GMO should be labeled. They just use what they have and they put it out there and they advertise it and people buy it and we have no idea. Europe is big, for the most part, anti-GMO. Africa, where a lot of these resources are originally grown, they're dealing with, well, what do we do? Do we label the GMOs? Because if we don't, Europe doesn't want them. If we do, Europe knows we're using them, right? So it becomes this huge thing. So here's the argument one way or the other. So the side that says, yes, we absolutely should label GMOs, the arguments are, the mandatory labeling of GMO products would give consumers the information necessary to choose whether or not to consume GMOs. Most countries, other than the United States, have signed agreements to regulate GMOs, including labels. U.S. consumers may wish to cut back on their consumption of GMOs until more is learned about their long-term effects on ecosystems and health. That is one of the biggest arguments against GMOs, is because they are so relatively new, within the last probably 60 years, right? The Green Revolution is what kicked off the use of GMOs. And this is the documentary we're going to watch, The Man Who Tried to Feed the World, is all about the creation of GMOs from the very beginning. But because they're new, right, we don't have a whole lot of information on how they might impact the environment long term, or how they might impact, humans long term, because they haven't been around that much for that long. On the other side of the argument, NABRA, labeling would unnecessarily spook customers because labeling is for health and safety, not for types of seeds. Mandatory labeling would severely disrupt U.S. agriculture, and that is accurate because GMO products are already widespread in the food system. And the private sector is increasingly labeling GMO-free products, so requiring GMO labeling is unnecessary because you've got manufacturers who are already labeling something as not being GMO or not having any GMOs. And so then requiring the opposite, that you label it if you do have GMOs, seems excessive and redundant. I don't know. I can see both sides. Ultimately, I personally don't have that much of an opinion one way or the other, but I'm interested to see what you guys think. This debate is one of the study guide questions for 9.3-4 in Canvas. Conserving resources, water is a big one, right? Without water, we can't do agriculture. A really good example is California. I think it's something like 80% of the water resources in the western United States goes to California for agriculture. And California has itself been in a drought for like years now. So we also want sustainable land management. We need to preserve the topsoil. We don't want wind or rain eroding precious, nutrient-rich topsoil. So the solution for keeping the topsoil is something called conservation tillage. So no tillage farming means that you leave the soil undisturbed and the entire residue from the previous season's crop is untouched in the fields. So think about it this way. Let's say you're growing corn. People come through, they harvest the corn, they cut the stalks down, right? Which means you still have, I don't know, a foot or so, foot to 2 feet probably of stalk on that's still in the ground, right? Generally what happens is the plows will come through and till those the dead root system back into the soil as part of the soil. But the concern is that if you do that, then you are leaving that soil open to environmental conditions, wind, rain, etc., and that it could potentially blow it away. So no tillage farming says, okay, we're going to leave those root systems, we're going to leave that, that bottom part of the stalk that is left after we harvest the corn, after we cut the stalks down, we're going to leave that alone. And we're just going to let it sit there because it helps keep the topsoil anchored onto the ground. The other idea, so that's no tillage farming. The other idea is ridge tillage farming, this is what, I didn't know that I actually did this until I started teaching AP geography. But this is what many people do in their gardens, myself included, where you plant crops on these little man-made ridges, right, that look like this, right? And you form them yourselves. You plant the seeds up here, and they grow. And then down here, this is where it drains. And so it doesn't pull from the soil that you've planted into, because the water will seep down and then drain down these little gullies that you've made. I do this in my garden. It works great. I didn't realize that it was like a whole, conservation tillage process. But you will see this happening as well because it automatically gives the water specifically a place to drain instead of it just washing away all of the topsoil. I do want to show you this. This is this graphic right here. This is of the Aral Sea, is what it's called. It's kind of in Central Asia. In 1977, this is what the Aral Sea. The Aral Sea is an inland freshwater lake, I guess I could call it, but it's bigger than a lake. It's ginormous. So it's referred to as an inland sea. So 1977, this is what it looked like. And then people started using it for irrigation. So 1986, 1999, 2006, 2009, 2013. By 2013, it was almost completely gone. It was generally considered like a dry lake bed at that point because there just wasn't any water left. So here is 2013. Oh, all right. Oh, but now people are actually trying to encourage it. They're being more judicious in their water resources and water usages. And so we are actually seeing it come back to life. Here is 2014. So what was in the middle is completely gone now. And you just have a little bit on the edges left. But then this one over here, this is 2017. And so we're starting to see it coming back, right? This is developed down here. This in the middle is coming back. So hopefully we are we are on the right track in making sure that these water resources are preserved and utilized judiciously. Okay. Moving on, global agriculture and undernourishment. So I'm sure you guys have all seen, the ads on TV that talk about, the starving children around the world. They're tragic. It's sad. You just want to gather them all up and bring them over for a big barbecue or something, right? But the issue remains is we have the ability to make, plant, harvest, create enough food for the world to eat. And so what do we do to make sure that that food is getting into the hands of the people that need it? Okay, so here's this sort of flow chart or line of thinking, right? So we've got food production is up. Up is a good thing. Undernourishment is down, right? Which means there are less starving children. That's a good thing. But global agriculture systems are causing major long-run damage to the environment and are not sustainable ways to meet humanity's need for food. Okay, so what we've done has sort of been the stopgap method, right? Like we've done enough to sort of get enough food, start reducing undernourishment. However, what we're doing, we can't keep doing. It's not sustainable for the environment. We will wreck the environmental resources that we have. So, the biggest increase in demand is locally grown food using sustainable farming methods. So we talked before about, food choices and local food preferences and how that directly impacts what manufacturers are doing. So the goal or the request of society, of people, is locally grown food, sustainable farming. But local and organic movements are not capable of providing affordable food for the world, right? Local and organic movements are great, right? Eat local produce, make sure that it's clean, doesn't use pesticides, doesn't use fertilizers, is sustainable. But those are small scale processes. They're not capable of providing affordable food for the world population. And so we've got to figure something else. So this is undernourishment. Undernourishment from 2000 to 2015 dropped from 924 million to 795 million. So from 15% of the world's population down to 11% of the world's population, which is great. Okay. But obviously there's still a long way to go. We still have like a tenth of the population, little more than, who don't have enough food, who are starving, literally starving. Yet another thing that I want to point out with this chart is it's probably different than you thought. So here, so this is other sub-Saharan Africa, but then if you look specifically over here, there's identified like individual countries within sub-Saharan Africa. So Ethiopia, Tanzania, Nigeria, Uganda. So that is 3062. let's see, 10, 13, 17, that's 30. No, that's 40. 72 plus Ethiopia. So 72. So 72 plus 148 is going to get you to 220, right? So the biggest food need is still in sub-Saharan Africa. But you maybe would not have identified India as the second biggest food need, with 195 million people that are undernourished. China is third with 134 million people who are undernourished. It should also be noted that the entirety of sub-Saharan Africa, the entirety of China, the entirety of India, these are huge population centers, okay? So you're seeing lots and lots of dense population, especially in India and China, where, yes, there's 195 million people, but there's almost 1 billion who live in India, right? So it's a big number, but there's a big population as well, okay? These aren't percentages. These are just actual individuals. Undernourished million of people, you can kind of see the trends. So South Asia, that's India. You can see it's trending downward. Sub-Saharan Africa was trending up, and now it's kind of leveled. East Asia, that's China, also trending down. Southeast Asia, trending down. Latin America, trending down. Developed regions have all been low and are staying low. That's a good thing. So the one concern that you see here is probably Sub-Saharan Africa, where the trend was up for a long time and then it trended down, but now it almost looks like it's going back up, right? So it doesn't have an obvious downward trend like you see in East Asia and South Asia. So challenges to feeding a global population. Lack of food access is obviously the big one. If they don't have food, they can't eat food. Specifically in the United States, there are issues with food insecurity and things called food deserts, which you probably have never heard as a term, but is kind of a fascinating idea. There are also problems with distribution systems, right? So making sure that if we've got enough food, that we get it to the people who need it. Adverse weather contributes to food issues. Land use loss to suburbanization and urbanization, obviously that's an issue as well. What you see, excuse me, on the map, this map is a map of food deserts. Food desert is defined as a high percentage of the population that has no car and no supermarket within 1 mile of an urban center, okay? So there's no car, they have no means of transportation other than public transit or walking, and they don't have a supermarket that's close enough for them to walk to. So if you think about that, these are people that would have to either get a ride from a neighbor or ride a bus or some other form of public transportation just to go to the grocery store. That's a huge inconvenience, I'm here to tell you. Especially if you have other food sources that are closer. Those food sources, however, are going to be things like fast food and convenience stores. If you had to live off of the food that you could buy at Maverick, you might have an issue with things like health problems, right? High cholesterol, heart disease, diabetes, all of those health issues that are directly impacted by your diet are going to be a bigger issue, right? So if we look at a map of food deserts and then we look at a map of heart disease, you're going to see some correlation there. We need to be able to provide people with a convenient way to access healthy food, because if we don't, then the food that they're going to eat is not going to be healthy, which is going to then translate to health problems. All right, sustainable farming. Organic is a big one, but it's expensive. Crops are grown without application of herbicides or pesticides and without using GMOs. The livestock are free range, right? So they can go wherever, they eat whatever. Antibiotics are only used for medical purposes. It's not used to help bulk up the animals. Crops and livestock are both cultivated on one farm in complementary fashion, which is great, but again, it's expensive. Expensive, and it's hard to do on a large scale. Government policies contribute to sustainable farming issues. In the United States, farmers get what's called subsidies to help their financial situation. The government provides subsidies to certain farmers for these things to avoid producing crops that are in excess supply. So I get that your land is conducive to corn farming, but we've already got enough corn, so I'm actually going to pay you to not grow corn. Okay? They pay farmers when commodity prices are low. So if all of a sudden there's a new corn producer somewhere in the world and they are producing lots of corn, and so now the price of corn went from $1 a bushel to 50 cents a bushel, then the people who produce corn all of a sudden are going to have their profits cut in half, which would encourage them to not be farmers. But the government needs people to be farmers, and so they step in and help subsidize or make up the difference for when those commodity prices go low, so that the farmers will stay in the farming business. The government will also buy surplus production and sell it to foreign governments or use it as part of the food stamp program, again, so that to help ensure that the farmer can sell his crop or her crop, which would then encourage that farmer to stay in the food production business. Because ultimately, farming is not exactly lucrative. You're not going to make like a huge living. You're not going to get wealthy being a farmer, but we need farmers. And so the government helps with these subsidies to help keep farmers farming instead of them choosing to go do something else. In developed regions, farmers are paid to grow less food, whereas developing countries struggle to increase food production to match population growth, which seems very ironic, don't you think? All right, the last topic 5.12, women in agriculture. Now, it's interesting because many of our different units talk about women specifically in some form or another. In this case, women in agriculture are going to play a very specific role depending on where they are, okay? The role of women in food production has changed. They started as gatherers, right? So if we go way back to the idea of hunters and gatherers, the men were the hunters, the women were the gatherers. And it is entirely likely that the women were the ones who originally invented agriculture. They're the ones that were gathering the berries and were like, hey, I wonder what would happen if I planted some of these seeds into the ground. So they're going from being gatherers to, in some cases, managing huge agribusinesses. But they also play a role everywhere in between. So if you think about subsistence farmers you're going to find those more predominantly in developing countries with, small plots of land where the goal is to make food, to grow food, to feed your family and feed your small village, that kind of deal. With subsistence farming, the women are working right alongside the men. They're plowing the fields, they're pulling weeds, they're harvesting, right? It's an all hands on deck kind of deal because we need food in order to survive. When you get into commercial farming, you find women in every role that you find men in, right? They're running the business, they're working with the animals, they're driving the tractors, all of the different things. But it's also important to note that not only has their role changed, but it's mostly women that are changing the way food is prepared and consumed. Okay, so if I were to ask you guys who it is in your household that makes dinner, I imagine most of you would say your mom. Maybe not every night, maybe your dad's got a night where he's in charge of dinner, or maybe the kids have a night where they're in charge of dinner or something along those lines. But for the most part, across the world, it is generally the women that are preparing the food. And so how they prepare it directly impacts what you're eating and then influences the various habits, likes, dislikes, preferences, choices that you end up making as an adult later, right? I can tell you right now that I make a lot of the same recipes that my mom made because they were my favorites when I was a kid. And so now that I'm an adult, I make them because I liked them then. And now I make them now, right? However, I've also found new recipes and I've experimented with different things. And so my daughter will have some of those family recipes, right, that have gone through generations, but she will also have the new things that I created, and she will probably go on to create new things of her own. But those trends and those choices often come back specifically to the women in the homes, which ultimately influences, on a grand scale, how things are produced, what things are produced, and then what they get manufactured into. So the role of women in agriculture is an interesting thing to think about, because if you look on the business side, they're part of everything, right? From gatherers all the way through CEOs of giant agricultural businesses. But the food preparation is where you see women often kind of on the front lines of deciding what those food choices are going to be and how they're going to influence then the production that gets made. All right. And that is it for this lecture. That's it for our entire agriculture unit. Again, make sure you're taking notes on your packet. And if, as we go through things, you guys have questions, make sure you note those and ask me them in class. All right. Thank you. I'll see you later.